Hello, and welcome to the official launch of NICE's Real World Evidence Framework. My name is Paul Jonsson, and I'm NICE's Program Director for Data and Real World Evidence, and I am also going to be chairing today's event. It's really great to see so many of you here today. I'm delighted to say that the webinar has attracted an international audience of a few thousand people. So I think clearly demonstrating the vast interest that exists in how we capture this type of evidence. And then, of course, how we can then use that to help us drive innovation into the hands of health and care professionals. And of course, ultimately, for the benefit of patients. Today, we are also joined by a number of NICE staff, and I'm delighted to say some external guests who will be reflecting with us on the role of real-world evidence in the work that NICE delivers for the health and care sectors. Now, before we start, I want to just remind you that you can download the framework by clicking on the link on the screen. And also feel free to submit questions throughout the session, and we will try and cover most of them as we can with the time available in our final panel session. Without much further ado, I would like to now welcome our first presenter, NICE's Chief Executive, Dr. Sam Roberts, to our virtual stage. Welcome, Sam.
Great, thanks, Pal, and welcome and thank you everyone for joining us from around the world. It's great to have such a large and diverse audience for our launch of the Real World Evidence Framework, because as you can imagine, this is a living document. So today you'll be seeing the first draft of it, but we look forward to many happy years working with lots of you on the call today to refine it, to develop it in the years to come. So thanks for being with us on the first step of that journey. I'm going to start a little by telling you about NICE, and then to talk about our experience with real-world evidence in the past, present, and future. So for those who don't know what NICE is, we're the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, and we use evidence to make decisions about what the most clinically and cost-effective care is for the population of this country. So we've had a long and happy history already with real-world data. A number of years ago, as you'll know, we launched the Cancer Drugs Fund, where we provide a range of cancer medicines alongside real-world data collection to ensure rapid access to patients. We also used real-world data in our economic models and for control arms of the increasing number of single-arm studies that we see through our technology appraisals. So we've got some experience with real-world evidence. But this effort is aiming to kind of take things to the next level. And it's very timely this year because we're making a real push into real world data in two big ways. So from a medicines perspective, and those who live in this country will have seen the launch of the Innovative Medicines Fund, which is a similar, kind of a sister project to the Cancer Drugs Fund, which is where medicines for all types of conditions can be provided for early access for patients in this country alongside real-world data collection. So if we're going to do that, we really need a robust framework where we all agree what's the right data to collect, is it good quality, and how can we use it? That's one big thing, launch of the Innovative Medicines Fund this month. The second big thing is that as we look at kind of the range of new technologies that's entering the UK, digital is taking a greater and greater focus in clinical care, and as well for us, thinking about how do we appraise digital technologies. So we're launching a new process this year as well called the Early Value Assessment, where we look at early indicators of value for digital technologies and diagnostics and devices that may not have the full evidence package that we usually look for at NICE, but shows signs of early promise. And then we're going to work with those technologies to develop their kind of evidence generation plans such that they can come back to NICE in future years with a fully kind of worked up and rigorous package of evidence that we can appraise. So very productive past with real world evidence, know that we need to do a step change for the future, and both for the Innovative Medicines Fund and early value assessments, and this is why this is really timely. But I don't think that we're going to stop here. If you look at the future that we're inhabiting in healthcare across the globe, what we're seeing is rate and scale of innovation increasing exponentially, ubiquity of data unlike anything we've ever seen before, patients and clinicians as equal partners in their care, and then health systems under increasing pressure. And as we look at this very complex landscape that we now live in, we at NICE think that it's not unreasonable to believe that real-world evidence will have a real role in kind of solving some of these really tricky problems. So, for example, by doing ongoing monitoring or assessment of new technologies that are fundamentally uncertain, or by monitoring uptake of new technologies to make sure that patients are actually benefiting to the same extent as we saw in clinical trials. So we're pretty excited overall, as you can hear, about real-world evidence at NICE. We've got great experience with it in the past, big step change this year, but we know that the future is going to be kind of much more bold and much more ambitious in terms of the role of real-world data in our assessment and in just the life of health services across the globe. So we're delighted to make a contribution to this important area, and really want to thank so many of you who helped the team to develop the content and participated in the consultation. As we say, this is a living document, so please keep the comments and suggestions coming. And then also a huge thanks to Pell, Seamus and the team for the really phenomenal work on this. We are impressed by you as always, and thank you and the team, and look forward to hearing the rest of the conversation now. Thanks, Pell. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Sam. That was great, and it really leads us perfectly on to the next speaker. So Dr. Seamus Kent, he's one of our senior scientific advisors, and he will give us an overview of the framework and what it aims to deliver. Over to you, Seamus.
Thank you very much, Pal, and thank you, Sam. So I'm going to talk a bit about the purpose and scope of this framework, describe its content in a little bit of detail, and talk a bit more about the future of the framework. So as Sam already says, there's an increasing role for real-world evidence in informing NICE recommendations to learn from the delivery of care, to learn from patient health and experiences. And the framework is one of a number of activities that we're undertaking to try and deliver on these ambitions. And it does this by clearly describing when and how real-world data can be used to improve recommendations, and describing best practices for planning, conducting, and reporting studies, with the aim of improving the quality and transparency of the evidence that we see, and really improving or increasing the trust and confidence in committees in using this data to make recommendations. So these are best practices. We're not looking to set minimum standards, and we advise that those who are using the framework read it alongside the relevant manuals that we're providing. So just a quick word on how we developed the framework. So of course, there's huge amounts of work that's been done over the last 10 years around real world data and observational data going back a lot further than that. And we're not trying to reinvent approaches, reinvent the wheel. We're really trying to collate this best practice research and put it together in a way that's meaningful for NICE and useful for our stakeholders. We worked with many stakeholders, I've listed some on the right-hand side throughout the development of this framework, including through multi-stakeholder workshops in January of this year and late last year, and through the open consultation in April. And I just want to reiterate Sam's thanks to all those who engaged in the work as we developed it and really improved it and maximized its value for users. So before I get into some of the details of the framework, just a few notes on definitions and a bit more about how we use real-world evidence already and can use it more in the future. So we're taking a broad definition of real-world data as data collected outside of highly controlled clinical trials. That data can relate to patient health and experiences or be about care delivery. And it can be quantitative or qualitative and includes all sorts of things: diagnoses, procedures, it might be free text information a doctor's written, patient-reported outcomes, omics data, and so on. And it can come from a variety of different sources. So routinely collected data, such as patient health records, healthcare service administration records, or more structured data collections like patient registries, observational cohort studies or health surveys. In a medtech context, we often see data from service evaluations and audits, and increasingly patients can generate data themselves through wearables, apps, and other devices. And by analysing that real-world data, we can generate real-world evidence, and we can use that to form all types of evidence that can be used in making recommendations. So things like understanding patient or user experiences, looking at the impact of tests or technologies on decisions about care or the delivery of care, characterising conditions, care pathways, outcomes, understanding the natural history of diseases, populating and validating economic models, assessing the generalizability of global trials to patients in the NHS, and also looking at the effects of technologies on patient and system outcomes. And as Sam mentioned, we actually already use real-world data for all of these kinds of use cases, but there's an opportunity to do so in a more systematic way. So within the real-world evidence framework, we specify 3 key principles for high-quality evidence generation. The first is to generate evidence in a transparent way and with integrity, from study planning right through to study conduct and reporting. The second is to ensure that data is trustworthy and fit for purpose for the specific application it's being used for. And the third is to use appropriate analytical methods that address the key risks of bias and characterize uncertainty. And we recognize that the depth of analysis, the depth of reporting has to be proportional to the use of that evidence. The type of evidence, is it for characterization or for understanding effectiveness? And how important is it for the recommendation that's being made? So again, we're not trying to set minimum standards, but indicating what best practices look like. So I'm just going, the rest of the framework really builds on this and tries to think about the implementation of these principles across different use cases. And I'm going to go through some key recommendations in this presentation. So in terms of planning and conducting studies, we really encourage clear specification of research questions and for studies to be planned in advance as far as possible. And for really higher risk studies like comparative effectiveness of medicines on patient outcomes, we really encourage the pre-specification of study protocols on publicly accessible platforms. Within the framework, we put a great deal of transparency on evidence generation over that cycle of generation. So from, as I said, specifying the research questions, identifying and describing the data sources being used, describing how that data is being curated, how it's gone from the source data to the analytical data set, the study design and statistical methods that are applied to that data, and of course, all the results that are generated through that process, including planned and unplanned analyses. And transparency is really essential. It allows independent researchers to reproduce the results, but for NICE, it really enables reviewers to understand what was done and why, and equip them adequately to be able to critically appraise studies, build confidence and trust in the use of them where appropriate to make those recommendations. Within the framework, we have a section looking at assessing data suitability, and we talk about data provenance and data fitness for purpose. So data provenance is really about understanding where data has come from, how it's being collected, how it's been managed, what quality assurance processes has it undergone, and what are the governance arrangements. And it's all really about understanding whether it's appropriate to use a data source to inform NICE recommendations. And it can be somewhat divorced from the specific research question or application. Fitness for purpose, in contrast, is really about the application and recognizes that a given data source might be extremely valuable for one application, but not for another. And for fitness for purpose, we really think about data quality and data relevance. So for quality, we're really thinking about the study variables that are important. So your population eligibility criteria, your outcomes, where relevant, your interventions, comparators, and important covariates. And we want to understand how complete these are at different time points, where data is missing, why is it missing, and how accurately that data is recorded. And this is extremely important because limitations to data quality can have important downstream consequences on study validity. So it's important for reviewers to understand these potential limitations and to be able to assess whether developers have addressed these through study design, through analysis and sensitivity analyses. Data relevance contains a multitude of questions. So first, does the data contain all these variables that we need in order to produce the evidence that we're interested in a valid way? And are they measured with the right level of clinical detail? We also want to understand whether the results that are generated are likely to translate generalized to patients treated in the NHS. So we need to understand who's included in the data, what the care pathways are, what are the care settings. Other components of relevance include sample size, follow-up, and the recency of data. Does it reflect current routine clinical practice? And within the framework, we recognize that there are often trade-offs between these different components of data relevance and data quality. So for example, between data locality, using national versus international data, and the clinical detail, does it contain the variables we need to produce valid estimates? And again, I just want to emphasize that we're not looking to set minimum standards. We're really encouraging presentation of data to enable us to understand it and make appropriate recommendations. And we recognize that different technologies, different disease areas have different sophistication of the data ecosystems and the ability to produce the highest quality data and evidence. So within the framework, we provide general recommendations for real-world evidence studies of different types. We provide a bit more detail around studies of comparative effects. And these can be used in the absence of trial evidence, for example, where trials are considered unethical, unfeasible, or to complement RCTs to answer a broader range of questions about the effects of interventions in routine settings. And there are, of course, a wide range of study designs that can be applied to estimate comparative effects, depending on the nature of the intervention and the technology and so on. Here, we really focus on cohort studies, and this includes trials where we're using real-world data to form external controls. So the recommendations we've developed really build on a previous NICE technical support document, number 17, which presents statistical methods for addressing confounding, whether from observed or unobserved sources. And it puts a lot more emphasis on the importance of good study design. And over recent years, there's been a great deal of incredible research showing the fundamental importance of study design in ensuring valid results, avoiding common selection and time-related biases. So we put some emphasis within the framework on what's variously called the target trial approach or trial emulation, where developers are asked to envisage the randomized controlled trial they would ideally like to perform if they had the opportunity to do so. Describe that trial and see how they can try and emulate it using observational data and describe the trade-offs and the limitations in doing that. So this is really helpful for trying to overcome some of these avoidable biases, to ensure transparent and clear reporting of study design, which of course really helps those reviewing evidence to understand the value of that for decision-making. But I think it's important to recognize that observational studies can be very complex, and there can often be residual concerns about remaining bias, perhaps due to unmeasured confounding or because of some limitations to the data. And there it's really important to use sensitivity analyses, including quantitative bias analyses, to really understand how robust the study conclusions and the recommendations are to these potential limitations. So as Sam said in her introduction, this isn't a one-off document, it's a living framework, and we need to ensure it's kept up to date. This is a fast changing area, new types of data available, new methods to interrogate that data, and advancing scientific understanding under what conditions these studies are most valid. And we need to keep the framework up to date in order for it to be of continued value to users. We also want to extend the framework for additional priority topics, and we asked within the consultation for stakeholders to identify where they thought there's a need for additional information. And key topics that kept coming up were more information about how to deal with really small sample sizes, specific issues around medtech, and the use of patient experience or qualitative data. And we look forward to trying to work further with stakeholders in advancing the framework in these areas. And this is a framework, and the framework's very important for improving the way we use evidence, but on its own, it's not sufficient. And there's a lot of work to do, which we've already started, around implementing the framework to actually ensure value is created. And as part of this, we want to measure the benefits of the framework and measure how we're using real-world evidence. So I just want to end by reiterating my thanks to everybody who was involved in the framework's development and really improved the final product. And we look forward to continuing to collaborate with new, as well as new collaborators, as we implement this framework and advance it in the future. And with that, I'll return to you, Pal.
Seamus, that was fantastic. A really clear and concise overview of the sort of the key aspects that the framework aims to deliver. Just to say to our audience, please remember to keep submitting your questions or observations. I'm seeing some already coming in. And just to reiterate, if we don't get to answer all of them live today, we are, of course, very keen to hear what you've got to say on the topic, and all your comments will be greatly appreciated. Now, throughout the development of the framework, we've been keen to hear how the framework might benefit those involved in the health and care system itself. So we spoke to people outside of NICE, and we will now run a short video that highlights how people feel the real-world evidence can help make a difference and how the new framework that we've developed now might support this. So let's see that video now.
For rare diseases, we have a paucity of clinical evidence arising from controlled clinical trials. So real-world data could be very important, but often it's messy and we need to undertake more rigor in the analysis of those data. So there's great potential there, but only I think the NICE's real-world evidence framework can help us achieve the potential for real-world data and its use in rare diseases.
So I believe real-world evidence can make a difference. So for example, as I live with type 1 diabetes generates a lot of data. And in terms of management of the condition, it's become very innovative in the last, say, 10 or 15 years or so, particularly when it comes to the use of diabetes technology. The real-world data coming from the technology is kind of here and now. And when all the changes are taking place, this having this data, which gives a clear idea of what's happening now, is only of benefit to the people living with diabetes.
Real-world evidence has a really critical role to play in the development, testing and adoption of innovations into the NHS.
Yeah, so I think real-world evidence, it can really enrich the evidence package that NICE uses in its guidance development. So including submissions from manufacturers and other stakeholders in their technology appraisals. There's some really exciting stuff going on in the RWE space, including building and connecting databases at scale. So really there's a lot of opportunities here to be taken. I think what's quite important for NICE guidance is that real-world evidence can add a lot of value in formally bringing in important perspectives like those of patients and clinicians, as well as providing insights into how well an intervention works when it's being used in routine clinical practice. And these insights can hopefully be gathered outside of the UK as well.
We collect huge amounts of data on patients in the NHS, on things like their disease, their treatments, patient characteristics, what their outcomes are over time. And so it makes sense to try to use that data to work out how well treatments are working in clinical practice, to help inform healthcare decision making and try to get the best outcomes for patients.
So for health technologies, sometimes it's either unethical or very challenging to run a traditional randomized controlled trial. And therefore, real-world evidence becomes a very critical way that you can demonstrate the value and the outcomes from health technologies. Additionally, they can really complement randomized controlled trial data by showing how the technology really performs when it's out of a very tightly controlled setting. And we've seen that give real benefits for patients that perhaps otherwise wouldn't have been captured in clinical trials.
NICE's real-world evidence framework outlines how we can use such real-world data. It emphasises the need to ensure data quality, and this chimes with what health system decision makers are saying across the world. The NICE framework provides clear guidance on how real-world evidence studies should be constructed using pre-specified analytical processes based on clear research questions. Only this rigor can help us resolve the really challenging uncertainties that arise in our discussions of treatment value.
I commend NICE for this very logical and well thought out framework. I think it sets clear expectations and provides specific recommendations that importantly focus on principled thinking and transparency and providing rationale and evidence for the decisions we make when we design studies and select data. In many cases, NICE goes farther than other similar RWE guidance documents by providing specific references to methods research and tools in the published literature that assist researchers in study design decision-making, but also provides new tools like the NICE dataset tool on data suitability. And even for real-world evidence that may be intended for submission to another decision maker, so I believe the NICE framework can be a very powerful tool.
Why the framework can support this is because when you take into account the kind of real-world evidence and you have people who are doing most of the management, it gives a clearer kind of update and picture of what is happening in relatively real time. Whereas if you don't have that framework in place and you're not using the real data that people are using, what's going to end up happening is the people using the technology and having all that data are going to be so far ahead.
We're delighted to see the framework launched. We think it's got a key role to play with some of the work we're executing through the Data for R&D programme and our investments in a range of subnational trusted research environments, which will make accessible the ranges of data that are required to support some of the recommendations in the framework. And we're really looking forward to working with Sam and the team in the implementation of some of the recommendations. And we're really thrilled to see that this is a key component about how we can take this framework to really test out some of those use cases through the trusted research environments we'll be investing into in the NHS in the next 3 years.
NICE's real-world evidence framework, it's a really comprehensive and I think accessible resource that can support those who are involved in generating and those who are using real-world evidence. There's two key things it could do to help. First is to improve the quality of the evidence NICE receives, and the second is to make a tangible difference in the use of real-world evidence in NICE's decision-making. I think if it can build confidence in the use of real-world evidence in guidance development, that will have the biggest impact for patients. Also, I think there's a lot that the NICE real-world evidence framework can really help support, and it really showcases NICE's efforts in helping to improve the use of real-world evidence in its guidance making.
Yeah, so I think the problem is analyses of these observational or real world or big data sets can be quite misleading if they're not done correctly. So while the data could be valuable, if you analyze them badly, then they might give us kind of false results. And even if you do the correct analyses, the results can be quite misleading if the data sources aren't good enough. So that's why I think NICE's real world evidence framework is a really important step towards improving the quality of real world evidence that we use in HTA.
So we're really pleased to see the NICE framework out there to give innovators guidance for how they could be constructing or looking towards real world data sources to prove the value of their technology.
Thank you, everyone who contributed to this clip. Great to hear those voices and opinions. I would now like to welcome Dr. Jacqueline Bouvi, NICE's Technical Director for Scientific Advice. She's here to talk to you about the support that we make available for those who are developing evidence and might want to use the framework. So, Jacqueline, over to you.
Thanks very much, Paul, and thanks for having me here today. So if you are listening to today's talks and you are wondering how you or your organization could make best use of the real-world evidence framework, I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to say a few things about the programs that we have available at NICE to help you doing exactly that. So the first program that you can consider reaching out to is of course our scientific advice program. So if you are a company and you are anticipating a NICE evaluation of your technology at some point in the future, and you want to make use of real-world evidence and apply the principles as they're set out in the framework as part of your clinical or your economic development plans. Within scientific advice, we can help you do that in the best possible way. And we have a number of different scientific advice offerings. So you can come for advice from NICE, but we also offer joint scientific advice with the MHRA, as well as with CADIS, the Canadian HTA agency. And some of the things we have been doing in scientific advice to make sure that we can offer you state-of-the-art support on applying and using real-world evidence as part of your clinical development plans and NICE submissions is that we're working closely with our colleagues in data analytics who have, of course, developed the framework, but we're also expanding the pool of experts that we work with in scientific advice to make sure that the advice we're providing you with is up to date and of relevance and high quality. Another program that I would like to highlight is NICE International. So if you are an organization working internationally and you are interested in either learning more about the real-world evidence framework, how NICE has developed it, or if you want to either use principles in the framework as part of your own methods and processes, or perhaps you're interested in developing your own real-world evidence framework that is relevant for your organization, NICE International is a program that can help you do that. And there are a number of different activities and knowledge transfer activities that they can offer to help you do exactly that. You can get in touch with the different programs in a number of different ways. There is an inquiry form on the NICE website on our Life Sciences page, but here you can also see the email contacts for both programs. That is it, and back to you, Pal.
Thanks, Jacqueline. I would really, as Jacqueline said, I would really like to encourage those who are developing evidence on new treatments or interventions to make use of the excellent service that NICE Scientific Advice offers. So we now come to our panel session, and I'd like to welcome back Seamus and introduce our other panel members who have joined us today. I'm very grateful that we have an excellent panel of experts here with us today. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Professor Gary Ford. Gary is chair of the Academic Health Science Network and chief executive of Oxford AHSN, as well as non-executive director of NICE. So welcome, Gary.
Good to be here.
I'd then like to, good to see you. I'd then like to introduce Dr. Alison Cave. Alison is Chief Scientific Officer, Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, the MHRA. Welcome, Alison.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
And lastly, but no means least, I'd like to welcome Dr. Blythe Adamson, Principal Quantitative Scientist at Flatiron Health. Welcome, Blythe.
Thank you.
So we've had throughout the session a number of questions coming in. So I'll try and triage some of those and see where we get to, because it's a broad topic and we no doubt could be speaking all day. But firstly, I mean, something that has popped up frequently in our engagement when we were developing the framework is that there is a great, or perhaps a lot of interest within the medtech industry in around using real-world evidence. And of course, our real-world evidence framework is intended to work across different types of technologies and different types of evidence. So, Gary, this one might be for you then. So, why is real-world evidence so important in medtech? And could you elaborate a little bit more about what the sort of unique challenges there are in that particular sector?
Yeah, so if we think about medtech, you've got, if you like, we think about it in three broad groups: devices, diagnostics, and digital. If you take all of them, and they vary in this, they differ in the level of evidence of effectiveness and often safety that they come to market compared to drug therapies, where we have a very well developed international system and an expectation of the level of data generally, although it's been talked about earlier, that is changing for some of the newer therapies in rare diseases. So you inevitably, with any new technology, don't fully understand in the broad population the balance of efficacy and risk, particularly also how it's going to work effectively in a healthcare system and clinical pathways. These are rarely issues that are sorted out in the development and trial stage. So it's very important that one obtains data to understand the impact, both in terms of the population using it, the efficacy, is it living up to what you would expect to see from the trial data you have, and safety, and then also how does it actually impact on the health system. And the reason the latter is so important is understanding, for example, the real impact of digital technologies or diagnostic technologies on workforce is hugely important given the worldwide shortage of healthcare professionals. So if one can understand and particularly capitalize and identify those innovations coming through, and this is particularly important for digital, which can really improve the effectiveness of healthcare systems through patient self-management in a safe and appropriate way, and supporting healthcare professionals work more effectively in pathways, those are really high value. So I think the other reasons that real-world evidence is very important for these is we need that data rapidly. We can't wait for 5 years to understand whether, what the effect, the true value of something, both in efficacy, safety, and broader values to a health system is through 5-year trials, for example. Otherwise we're going to be sitting there with all this innovation we're just not capitalizing on, and we're missing opportunities. So we need that rapid gathering of data, high quality analysis and synthesis. And that, I think, is the difference from the traditional ecosystem approach we've taken. And then my final comment is why the framework is so important and why this is so important is it comes to the issue around probity of data and confidence in data. We need the health systems to collect data, the right data, and in a way we can be confident about that data when we analyze it. So it's not just researchers, it actually goes right down into the data being collected within the NHS.
Thank you, Gary. That's very helpful. And I think another challenge, as you say, in that sector is the scale and the number of technologies and how quickly they develop. And therefore, it's really important for us to travel on this journey with the AHSN and technology developers and understand how we can best support those who are developing innovative technologies. So one hand, we've got medtech, another hand, we've got pharma, and pharma clearly is well embedded into the concept of RCT when they bring drugs to the market. So I have a question perhaps for you, Alison. So the MHRA have been developing guidance around the use of real-world data. In your opinion, how important do you think is to reach an alignment between you as the regulator and NICE as an HTA body, or generally speaking, regulators and HTA bodies? Do you have any views on that?
Yes, thanks very much, Pal. And as I think most people listening today are aware, actually achieving patient access is what we're here to do. And for a new medicinal product in the UK, obviously approval by ourselves is the first step in that, and also requires a health technology appraisal by NICE. And obviously each body has different remits and different evidence requirements, and hence a study that's suitable for regulatory approval may not always translate into data suitable for reimbursement decisions. And unfortunately, this can sometimes lead to delays for patients in accessing new medicines, especially if then additional studies are required. And that's why I think it's very important that as regulators, we all work together as much as possible to identify where we can align in those evidence requirements, where we can understand what the possible differences are, where the different perspectives lie, and potentially also identify early in the development pathway where the uncertainties are and how do we fill those gaps. And in this way, while still respecting the roles and remits of each body, I really believe we can start to drive efficiencies in our process and bringing those new innovations to patients and actually reduce duplication of effort. Because what we want to do is bring those two processes, those two decision points together as much as possible for the benefit of patients. And as you're aware, we're already doing this in the UK to a certain extent through the innovative licensing and access pathway. And if people on the line are not aware, this is a partnership between MHRA, NICE, the Scottish Medicines Consortium, and also All Wales Therapeutics and Toxicity Centres, a lot of supportive partners in the health ecosystem. And the ambition here is to do exactly what we've just said, to try and bring products to patients as early as possible through early dialogue in that partnerships, discussing with companies on clinical trial design as early as possible to ensure optimal data is generated for both regulatory approval and health technology appraisal. And I really think the framework today will be a very powerful tool in supporting this work.
Thank you, Alison. So you mentioned some of the mechanisms that we have in place at the moment in trying to ensure alignment. Is there anything that you might envisage in the future that might be helpful to drive that further forward? Or?
Well, I think it's important to note, as I've just kind of touched on, that we are already working together on real world data in a number of different streams, because it's such a key strategic focus for both organisations to actually evolve and enhance our evidence generations, because as set out earlier, we do believe that real world data can bring additional insights in a number of areas where it's not possible to capture those insights through our more traditional routes. And that's really true in the safety space, with the ultimate aim of understanding the performance of medical products in clinical use. So I think we've got a number of different options through our guidances. And as you know, we already discuss and align on those guidances. And I think, listening to Seamus today and reading through the guidances, there's a number of areas where we're already aligned, in the three principal areas around transparency, absolutely key around the transparency of a protocol and a pre-specification ideally. We've got alignment, I believe, on data quality. And we'll further align through the ILAP process and some of those metrics. And then, of course, methodologies, which for me is an absolutely equal partner with the data in driving a decision and a evidence that we can actually trust. And we know we have a number of other areas where we're collaborating through our data and analytics methods and standards programs, and we've done some preliminary work through CPRD, which is the Clinical Practice Research Data Link, how that might inform the work of NICE if we use it regularly to inform the safety work and other areas of work within MHRA. And I think we've explored how the feasibility and appropriateness of some of the outcomes that you use in your quality outcomes frameworks could be derived from that real world evidence. And then, of course, I come back to the ILAP procedure where we're developing the continuous benefit risk tool. And that will be a really powerful tool to support a proactive and strengthened life cycle approach to evidence generation. And I think that's what we're looking for across the whole product life cycle, right from earliest development through to authorization and then through to the post-authorization space, to better monitor both the benefits and risks of products on the market. So I hope that gives the audience a sense of where we are.
Yeah, and it's great to travel on this journey with you, the regulators, Alison. So a question around sort of decision making, and so obviously quality and reliable data is the bedrock of reliable real-world evidence. So this one might be for you, Blythe. To what extent do you think the framework captures the key questions that you need to assure yourself of quality when you're assessing whether data is suitable for decision making?
Well, this framework captures really critical dimensions of high quality data that's also valued by Flatiron Health, as we're curating electronic health records to create derived data sets for informing these types of very, very critical decisions. And the attributes that the framework lays out are building on provenance of this type of data, the recency that's necessary to inform that decision, and importantly, clinical depth of relevant variables that are essential to be able to answer those questions and make it fit for purpose. And in the NICE Flatiron research collaboration that we've been working on for several years together with Pal and Seamus and others, we've been able to execute case studies to demonstrate the possibilities of using high quality data to be able to reduce uncertainty in some of these NICE decisions. And key variables like functional performance status, biomarkers, lab results, it was revealed to be incredibly essential to demonstrate the quality of each one of these variables in terms of completeness and accuracy, so that the evidence that's generated is able to be robust and reliable to make these types of important decisions.
Thank you, Blythe. And of course, real-world evidence, in the framework, we place a lot of emphasis on transparency, and we heard that mentioned before. So, Gary, how important is transparency in medtech? We know we've got reporting standards and requirements in pharma. Where do you see the role, what do you see the role of transparency, or to what extent can we be transparent in medtech?
Well, it's equally important. I mean, for obvious reasons, you've got to understand the provenance of the data as has been discussed, else otherwise you have unreliable results. I think one of the challenges is how one takes routinely collected data, which wouldn't necessarily be subject to the sort of standard audit checks that will be undertaken in clinical trials. So, but it doesn't mean there are no standard checks on that. But we have a lot of very rich national audit data sets where there's a really unrealized potential for some of those. And I think we have very good examples where data collected in routine clinical practice has been really valuable and high enough quality to inform decision making. Some of the one of the things, the European-wide database on thrombolysis in stroke, must be over 20 years ago, that I was involved with. We collected data from routine clinical practice, not in a research context. There was some audit of that, and that was very valuable in informing relicensing review after the provisional license of thrombolysis. So, which I think again raises another issue around how what sort of geographic or centre coverage do you want? We don't want data from single sites collected by and analysed by the same people. Having that sort of independent oversight of the data in terms of checks and then analysis, I think, is important in terms of understanding that. A lot of, for example, evaluations undertaken in our healthcare system are done by the people who commission them, and they're not independent. And I think there are problems with that. If you come down to basic things like pre-specifying your analysis before you start digging around in data. So I think there are good standards. We know a huge amount of this from, of course, the research world and experience over the last 50 years about the importance of data quality, of transparency, being aware of conflict, and all these will play out in equally important way in real-world data sets as well.
Thank you. And then we've got some questions about future directions for the framework. Perhaps, Seamus, you could sort of tackle some of those. So one here is will there be further guidance on how best to demonstrate qualitative evidence for a NICE submission? So they're thinking about patient voices, PROs, and so on. Do you have any sort of thoughts around how that might develop?
Yeah, there's definitely great value in using that kind of data to inform recommendations. And as I mentioned in the presentation, when we went out to consultation, we did include a question about what people thought were important areas for further development. And patient experience and qualitative data was something that came up quite often. So I think there's definite value in doing it. We need to work out how we can best do it, who we need to work with, how we should go about it. So I think there's lots of work to do there, but it's clearly an important topic and one that keeps coming up again and again.
And something that is quite sort of topical at the moment is health inequalities. Seamus, what do you think about the role of real-world evidence to help uncover those and potentially adjust for those in practice?
Yeah, it is a use case that we highlighted within the framework because it's increasingly been possible to kind of look at this data, look who's using certain interventions, for example, who's not using them, variations in clinical practice across different sort of protected groups and otherwise. So I think there's great value in there. We provide an example around sickle cell disease, which affects a particular population in the UK. So I think there's great value in doing that, and we have been exploring with CPID and other data sources the extent to which we can kind of more routinely do this kind of work when looking at guidelines as well as in technology appraisals. Thanks,
Seamus. And a question that's popped up periodically, and we keep debating. I wonder if the panel has any views on that. So could real-world evidence ever replace trial evidence, or is the role only to complement RCTs? Anyone who wants to comment on that?
I'll comment if you want, because I think I'll give a frustrating answer with it depends, and it would depend on the question. So it would depend on, the question you're looking at, your ability to capture data in another way. Is there an unmet need? Is a trial actually feasible or possible? It will depend on the endpoint that you're looking at and how well it's captured, potentially in a real world data set. So, it would depend on the quality of the data set and the scale, potentially, of the data that you've got and the numbers of events that you would see in the data set, as well as the sort of representativeness of that data set. So I think we would always be open to looking, but it will very much depend on a number of factors of the particular use case that you were talking about. And I think it's probably good not to think of either or, but probably both, and look really very much to how they can complement each other in improving our evidence generation.
Any challenges to Alison on that, or are we all in an agreement?
Just an addition, pal. I would add, depends on the area you're talking about, depends on the risk benefit. But we already use many medtech, which have not been through randomized controlled trials. Let's be absolutely clear. And it's not a very good methodology for example, understanding the value of an MRI scan in acute stroke. There are randomized controlled trials of therapies which use imaging approaches, but that's not randomizing an RCT of assessment of the diagnostic. I think in digital, there'll be some therapeutics which definitely need RCTs, but there will be many digital interventions which do not, and it will be a form of judgment. And many of these will be better evaluated by collection of real-world data. And it's not an either-or. There are all sorts of study designs one can do, stepwise rollout, interrupted time series. And these are done for many service interventions because it simply isn't possible to do pure randomized controlled trials. And when people try and do them, it's very challenging. So I think one has to have a serious consideration about, comes back to what is the evidence you need to inform the health service and patients about the value and safety of an intervention. And you have to start with that question and work out what you need to know in the context of the technology, rather than start with, we have to use this methodology.
Yeah, great. And it's really good to see that there is an alignment here, even though the viewpoints are slightly different. And I'm hoping that the way we've sort of pitched the framework around the contextualizing the question and looking at the question they need answering, and then look at then selecting the right evidence for that purpose, and obviously making sure the quality is as good as possible. So here's a more technical question, perhaps for Blythe. So our ability to harness real-world data, including unstructured data, is increasingly increasing. So what do you think are the opportunities in the future, and what are the key challenges that we face in making sense of data like that? If you get your crystal ball on.
One of the approaches to making sense of this challenging unstructured data, and we're thinking about PDF lab results, sequencing reports, the free text that you mentioned before that are in clinician notes, or even imaging, radiology images. One of the main approaches is through abstraction. So at Flatiron, we have more than 1,000 clinical professionals, such as nurses, that are opening up these electronic health records, extracting that critical information, using standardized policies and procedures for hundreds of thousands of patients. And you asked, what is the future going to look like? What are the opportunities that are now emerging? And I would say that the most exciting opportunities I see are in further scaling this with artificial intelligence and machine learning. At Flatiron, one of my favorite teams is the machine learning team, where they're now using the foundation of all of that gold standards labeled data that I mentioned before from hundreds of thousands of patients, and using natural language processing to train machine learning models to extract the same information that these human clinical professionals were looking for within the charts. And the opportunity then becomes learning from the experience of not only a few 100,000 patients, but now the opportunity to learn from millions of patients very quickly. And as NICE is trying to make decisions that uses recent data that's actionable and timely to get access to this population with the best information possible, being able to do this at scale and quickly, to be able to generate that timely, reliable, robust evidence is going to be really important in the future.
Thank you, Blythe. And just as we're starting to think that we're getting to grips with the real-world evidence, now we've got machine learning and other bits to look at as well. So that's an exciting upcoming task. We're almost running out of time, but I wonder if we have time for one more question. So we heard from Nick Latimer earlier around data quality. You can make wrong decisions if the data hasn't got good quality for its purpose. So this is both a theoretical, a methodological and practical question. So how do you plan to manage the quality evaluation of data from observational study? How can we deal with low quality data classified by tools like Robbins or others, for example? So what are the technical aspects of managing quality, and what are the practical aspects? Who wants to deal with the technical one very briefly? Blythe, would you like to, or Seamus?
Yeah, I'll pass on to Blythe. I apologize.
Oh no, I was just going to compliment how in-depth the framework and what Seamus has built goes into detail, describing all of the different ways that we should be reporting on data quality and transparency. It goes into the nuances of even time dependency. We may have one level of accuracy for a certain time point, and a different amount of accuracy at another time point. And also the nuances of sometimes we have binary variables, a true, false. Other times we have dates. So how accurate is a date compared to what we think is the truth? What's the difference in time between those things? And so this framework goes into much more detail than any other real-world evidence framework that I've seen of how we can practically apply these principles for transparency and equipping the decision makers with the information that they need to form good judgments.
Thank you, Blythe. I knew we could speak all day about this, so I knew we'd run out of time. We've got loads of questions, we've captured them all, and there'll be food for thought, and we'll reflect on those internally and possibly come back to you with more answers. So on that note, that brings us to the close of this event. Thank you again to all our speakers, to contributors, to our panelists, and of course, indeed, you audience. And I'd like to encourage all of you who are interested in further detail to have a look at the framework. It's now available online, as I said. And with that, we really hope that you found this event useful, and we look forward to seeing you at a future NICE event. Thank you and good night.